Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has abruptly moved up his visit to Washington. He'll now meet President Trump this Wednesday, February 11th. The reason? Deep alarm in Jerusalem over the direction of US-Iran talks. While President Trump is calling last weekend's negotiations in Oman very good, Netanyahu is rushing to Washington to make sure any deal with Iran doesn't leave Israel facing an existential threat. Last Friday, US and Iranian officials sat down for 8 hours of indirect talks in Muscat. This was the first high-level contact since military exchanges last summer. The US team, led by envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, aimed to establish a framework to end the nuclear standoff. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi called it a good start, and President Trump described the talks as very good. But Araghchi also made something clear. Iran's right to enrich uranium on its own soil is non-negotiable. That's Iran's red line. And that statement is what has set off alarm bells in Jerusalem. Netanyahu is heading to Washington with what Israeli media is calling the three no's. Israel's absolute demands for any Iran deal. No uranium enrichment on Iranian soil, period. Israel wants Iran's enrichment capability completely dismantled. No ballistic missiles with ranges exceeding 300 kilometers. Israel argues these missiles aren't just regional threats, they're global ones that can reach Europe. No continued funding for the axis of resistance. That means cutting off money to Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and other Iranian-backed groups. Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar put it bluntly: a nuclear-only deal that ignores missiles and proxies would give Tehran sanctions relief to rebuild the very forces that threaten Israel. These groups took heavy losses in conflicts last year. Israel doesn't want them resupplied with Iranian money. Here's the problem. What Iran said was non-negotiable in Oman directly contradicts what Israel says is non-negotiable. Iran insists on its right to enrich uranium domestically. Israel demands zero enrichment. Iran says missiles are purely defensive and off the table. Israel says they must be eliminated. Iran won't discuss its regional alliances. Israel says that has to be part of any deal. And caught in the middle, President Trump trying to broker an agreement that satisfies both his key Middle Eastern ally and his goal of preventing Iranian nuclear weapons. What makes this situation unusual is that diplomacy is happening alongside massive military pressure. On Saturday, the day after the Oman talks, Witkoff and Kushner visited the USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier in the Arabian Sea. That's a deliberate signal. We're talking, but we're also ready for military action. President Trump has warned of very steep consequences if a deal isn't reached quickly. The US also announced fresh sanctions over the weekend, targeting 14 vessels in Iran's Shadow Fleet, the ships that smuggle Iranian oil to buyers in China. This is what analysts are calling diplomacy by coercion, negotiate while maintaining maximum military and economic pressure. Iran has responded with its own threats. Araghchi warned that if US military pressure turns into actual strikes, Iran will retaliate against American bases throughout the Middle East. Now coming to the political dimension, this is delicate. President Trump wants a landmark foreign policy win early in his second term. A deal with Iran would stabilize global oil markets. We've already seen Brent crude drop below $68 per barrel on hopes of an agreement. That would lower gas prices and boost Trump's approval ratings. Netanyahu faces different pressures. His domestic audience views any Iranian enrichment capability as an existential threat. Politically, he cannot accept a deal that leaves Iran with nuclear infrastructure. So Wednesday's meeting will test what both leaders call their unbreakable bond. The core technical issue is uranium enrichment levels. Iran is currently enriching to 60%, very close to the 90% needed for a weapon. The US wants that reduced significantly. Israel wants it eliminated entirely. Here's what complicates this. Iran argues that enrichment for peaceful nuclear energy is its sovereign right under international law. They point to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which allows civilian nuclear programs. But Israel and the US say you can't trust Iran's intentions. They point to the fact that Iran hid its nuclear program for years before it was exposed. The International Atomic Energy Agency is now seeking surprise inspection rights, the ability to check Iranian facilities without advance notice. Tehran's response to this demand will be crucial. If Iran accepts surprise inspections, it could build some trust. If they refuse, it suggests they have something to hide. There's another complication: China. The US just sanctioned 14 ships for carrying Iranian oil, but China is the primary buyer of that oil. If Chinese companies keep buying despite sanctions, what does the US do? Trump has hinted at escalating to tariffs on China if they continue purchasing Iranian oil, but that risks a broader economic confrontation with Beijing at a time when trade relations are already strained. This is why the shadow fleet sanctions matter. If they don't actually reduce Iranian oil sales because China ignores them, the US loses leverage in the nuclear talks. As we head into this critical week, here's what to watch. First, Wednesday's statement. Will Trump and Netanyahu issue a joint declaration establishing shared red lines? Or will we see public divergence in their positions? Any daylight between Washington and Jerusalem will embolden Tehran. Second, the shadow fleet sanctions impact. Will China actually stop buying Iranian oil, or will they ignore the sanctions? If purchases continue, expect the US to escalate pressure. Third, Iran's response on inspections. The IAEA wants surprise inspection rights. If Tehran agrees, talks could progress. If they refuse, it signals they're not serious about transparency. The stakes here are enormous. For Trump, this is about a foreign policy legacy and keeping oil prices low. For Netanyahu, it's about preventing a nuclear-armed enemy 90 minutes flight time from Tel Aviv. For Iran, it's about economic survival. Sanctions are crippling their economy while maintaining regional influence and domestic legitimacy. And for the broader Middle East, it's about whether we see de-escalation or move toward a conflict that could draw in multiple countries and disrupt global energy supplies. Wednesday's meeting in Washington between Trump and Netanyahu will be one of the most consequential diplomatic moments of the year. Can Trump convince Netanyahu to accept a deal that allows some Iranian enrichment? Can Netanyahu persuade Trump that comprehensive dismantlement is the only safe option? Or will they agree to disagree, potentially derailing the entire negotiation process? The Oman talks showed that dialogue is possible, but translating that into an actual agreement that satisfies the US, Israel and Iran, three parties with fundamentally different red lines, remains an extraordinary challenge.